In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is not Kurt Jarris sitting in this saddle this afternoon. My name is David Montoya, and it is a pleasure to be with you to discuss a very important topic on today. If you'd like to have your voice heard, there are a couple of ways you can get in touch with us. All you have to do is text the word Veracity to 555-888, and you can text me your comments, your questions, or even your show requests to that number. You can also reach out and contact us through Twitter, Facebook, or just search Veracity Hill, and you can get into contact with us. For today, we are covering a very important topic, a topic that I personally have used a number of times. It's my go-to argument for the existence of God when I'm speaking to an atheist or agnostic, or in general to a skeptic that is doubting the existence of an all-powerful God. And admittedly, my background is in math. I have a degree in finance, and so that's where my expertise and my affinity to this argument comes from. I'm horrible at letters. I can't even spell at the beginning of the show. Rob, I was telling you that I couldn't even spell the word teleological. So, as it is, the numbers are just much better. Much better. For me, anyway. So here we are. It's talking about the teleological argument, that is to say, the argument for design. Now, usually when we hear this argument being used in the common lay-level churchgoer, you will hear something go like this. Well, we know that the universe was created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent being because it shows elements of design. That is to say, we can see that the sun, if it was any further from the earth, it would be too cold for us to live, and if it was any closer to the earth, we'd burn up. Or the oxygen level is just right, that if it wasn't at the spot that it's at currently, then there would be, if it was too much or higher than what it is today, then there would be spontaneous fires erupting all over the place, and we've seen the wildfires in California. There would be more of those. Or if it'd be too less than what it is now, we wouldn't be able to exist at all. So this is sort of the common way this is actually presented. But here we have our guest we brought on, and Kurt had asked me, who do you want to interview on the episode this afternoon? And I said, I looked on the website, one of our websites is apologetics315.com. That's apologetics315.com, and I clicked on a link that brought me to our guest's YouTube page, and I began to devour all the videos, and I said, yeah, this is the person I definitely want to interview for today. We present to you none other than Allen Hainline. Pleasure, Allen. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on. This should be fun.
Excellent. So we're going to go ahead and talk about, we'll dive right in. The time is short, and so we want to get as much of your wisdom as possible coming through the show today. So let me ask you a basic question. The teleological argument, or the argument for design, what are the basic premises of the fine-tuning argument?
Okay, yeah, there's different ways to characterize it, and we should probably point out that within teleological arguments, there's a number of variants. And so, yeah, the version that I'm wanting to defend today would be one based on the fine-tuning of the laws, constants, and initial conditions. So it would not be the environmental aspect that you previously alluded to. And in this version of it, you basically look at the very most fundamental aspects of physics, which is my background. And by the way, this line of evidence had a very important impact on me personally as I went through a period of doubts a number of years ago and just saw that, wow, there's a lot more evidence out there than I realized that really does seem to point to purpose, which is what the underlying meaning of teleology is, the study of purpose, or really design, yeah. But so this is very important to me. And the way I would characterize it is that these coincidences that we see in the most foundational physics are either due to design or not. If they're not due to design, it's some combination of necessity or chance. And then there's really good arguments that it's not just, these are not necessary aspects. Almost no physicist thinks that all these particle masses and force strings and things like that are due to any kind of underlying necessity. And then the odds, when you look at how coincidental things have to be for the universe to be right for life, it just looks like chance is a really lousy explanation. To the extent that you rely on chance is the extent to which you should assume this is evidence for a designer. And then the fact that this design is at the most foundational level. Whoever the designer was able to control all these different constants of nature and the initial conditions, things which would seem to be physically impossible to control. And therefore, the most plausible designer at that foundational level is God. I think this is even more clear than other kinds of intelligent design arguments.
Sounds good. So what we're trying to say here is that when we speak about the initial conditions, what we're saying is that there is no time for these attributes, these constants that we see in the universe, the physical laws, the ones that we learn in a physics class, they have no time to evolve whatsoever. They are full-blown existent at the very start of the universe. This is what we want to focus on today. And if we see that, we see these improbabilities and we begin to stack them one upon each other, where if we have an improbable constant, and then we see another improbable constant and another improbable constant, it stands to reason that someone intelligent created all of it. So usually the way this is put, and the premier example that I would like to present to the audience, as opposed to like the sun or the oxygen, we're talking about initial conditions, full blown without any evolution time. It's there at the start of the universe, and the one I want to bring to the audience is called the cosmological constant. Now, Alan, what is the cosmological constant?
Well, this one certainly has grabbed a lot of attention among scientists of all backgrounds and persuasions, and this relates to the expansion rate of the universe. Under general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, there is a potential term here that could cause the universe to either accelerate or contract. And then in quantum field theory, there's also known huge contributions that would seemingly cause the universe to expand at such a rapid rate that it would just be a thin hydrogen soup with no chance of life. And it's only by balancing positive and negative contributions that we end up with this tiny, tiny energy level that causes the universe to expand. And so had it been much more, then we would have had particles rarely even touching each other, much less chemistry or planets or stars or anything of that nature.
So essentially, we have gravity that exists in the universe, and this cosmological constant, could you say is an anti-gravity force?
Sure, in the sense that it's a repulsive force that's pulling everything apart. It's acting just the inverse sense to which gravity causes everything to attract toward each other.
All right, so say if we go to very basic physics, third law of Newtonian physics says, when a body exerts a force on a second body, the second body simultaneously exerts a force equal in magnitude and opposite in direction on the first body. Or in layman's terms, that is to say that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So we have gravity, and on the other side, we have a cosmological constant, or an anti-gravity force, to just put it simply.
Right. So
it's not that simple, but I mean, it's.
Yeah. So you think about gravity for a minute to understand the significance of the cosmological constant. Consider how the universe evolves over time, changes over time. we've got all this matter and it was going apart. That's the Big Bang Theory. And then you would expect gravity is going to be gradually causing that to slow down, right? Because there's an attractive force. But in the late 1990s, they discovered that actually, when we look far away at these exploding stars, we see that the further away we are, the faster things are accelerating away from each other. And so they discovered that the universe is not just expanding, but it's actually accelerating in its expansion.
Yep. So
in order to cause that, you've got to have some kind of repulsive force.
Correct. So in essence, there is a fine balance between this gravity and this anti-gravity force, the anti-gravity force being this cosmological constant. And as you alluded to just now, if it were any larger than what it is, what would happen?
Yeah, if it were, there's a wide range of possible values it could hold because, as I said, there's these enormous contributions that are based on the quantum field theory. So we know that there's these huge contributions, but somehow there's also ones that almost perfectly cancel out. And so if they didn't perfectly cancel out like that, you would end up with the universe flying apart in rapid acceleration from basically the very beginning of the universe. Mm-hmm. And that would prevent the matter from aggregating together, collecting together. You would never really have anything beyond proteins, if you even had those, depending on exactly how large the value was. But in one common way of discussing the scenario where there's a larger cosmological constant is that you just have hydrogen, you just have protons, and they're flying apart from each other and spreading out at an accelerating rate. And so if it was fine-tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the 90th power, these protons would only collide with each other on timescales of billions of years. So no one thinks that you could have life in such a universe, because hydrogen alone, we wouldn't have any chemistry. You wouldn't be able to store information such as any form of life would require if it is to replicate and potentially evolve, even if you assume very vigorous assumptions about what evolution could or couldn't do. The whole thing about fine-tuning is it's considering what is necessary before any kind of evolution could even start. Yep. Or just what do you need right for life. It doesn't necessarily have to tie into evolution, but a key point is even if you grant, for the sake of argument, biological evolution, you still end up with all these things that are required for fine-tuning for life. And so there's a number of these cosmic coincidences to mind-boggling levels of precision, all of which point to the need for some kind of a design or setup. It looks incredibly rigged for life.
All right. So if it was larger than what it is today, you wouldn't have any galaxies, any stars, no interactions whatsoever. It'd be a thin, uniform hydrogen and helium soup. If it was lower, it would just collapse upon each other. So now that we've established what the cosmological constant is an anti-gravity force, repulsive force, opposite of gravity, let's look at what the calculation is. And I'm just going to go ahead and look at the camera, and I'm going to tell you what the calculation is. It's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and I keep doing that for 123 times, and then I put a 2 at the end. So once again, a 0, 0, 0, 0. I do it for 23 times, and then I put a 2 at the end. That's the number. And now, Alan, what is the probability of that number in our discussion here today?
Okay, let me mention that, a lot of physicists, even atheist physicists and so forth, will grant you that it's fine-tuning to about 1 in the power of 10 to the 120th. Although some latest research by a friend of mine, Luke Barnes, and many others at Durham University and other places shows that maybe it's not quite as finely tuned as that. But I like kind of going and with Luke Barnes has a very, very conservative number that he tosses out that, if you want to be as optimistic as possible about the possibilities for life, you could have fine tuning still at about 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. And it just so happens that's roughly the number of subatomic particles in the known universe, part of the universe for which we can verify its size. So you can think then of the scenario of what are the odds of choosing any subatomic particle anywhere in the whole universe and getting just the right particular particle. and that would be equivalent to the odds of getting a life-permitting value for the cosmological constant.
All right. Well, we're talking about cutting-edge research. As we've stated earlier, the common number is 1 in 10 to the 120th power. Now, let me break that down for our audience in layman's terms. Let's say we have a concept in finance called spending power. And say I have $10. Now, if I add another zero to that 10, it becomes $100. Obviously, $100 buys much more than just $10. But if I add another zero to this, I go from 100 to 1,000. And I add another zero, I go from 1,000 to 10,000. You start to see how that exponentially grows. The more zeros I add, the more your spending power, but it goes up exponentially. And it's the same concept with probability. As soon as you start to add what is called orders of magnitude, that is to say powers, increasing in powers of 10, adding the zeros to it, it becomes outrageous. So in this case, we have a 1, the probability of one chance in 1 with 120 zeros after it. It's an absolutely astronomical number. So you've given an analogy here, Alan, concerning the amount of particles in the entire known universe, that if you were to mark one with an X and you had an equal chance of picking one, any one of those particles, that you would choose the right one would be this probability. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, so we have this number, and the way you can articulate this to your skeptic friend is you have 10 fingers. All you have to do is just say one chance in a trillion, 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 trillion. Just say the number, the word trillion, with the amount of fingers you have on your hands, and that's the probability. One chance in 10 trillions. Just say it. So that's how you articulate it to a skeptic. You walk them through how improbable it is, and then you tell them that's a crazy number. Is there another constant that's not dependent on the cosmological constant, also that's full-blown, ready to go at the start of the universe?
Certainly, yeah, there's a number of them. I mean, most of the kind of constants that the average person would have encountered in their science studies have to be finely tuned quite a bit. For example, there's 4 fundamental forces. You have to get all 4 of those in the right proportion. There's particle masses of things like protons, neutrons, electrons, and even lesser known things like neutrinos. The mass of those turns out to be significant. And then the particles that make up protons and neutrons, which are namely quarks. Quarks, in fact, have to be finely tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the 34th power. Wow. And so there's just a whole host of these kind of exquisite fine tunings across parameter space.
And in probability theory, you don't simply add probabilities together. It becomes exponential in terms you have to multiply them together if you're taking a probabilities class. So say if you had a probability of 1 chance in 2 and another probability of 1 chance in 3, you don't just add those together, you have to multiply them. So it'd be 1 chance in, obviously, 6 in this case, if we were to do that math.
That's right, yeah. So when you're talking about all the trillions on your fingers, you have to make sure the person listening realizes you're multiplying those together 10 times. You've got to get 10 to the 12th power right.
Yeah, so in essence, the argument is that this is so improbable that obviously a designer had to put this all together. It's just the more reasonable conclusion without having to jump through so many hoops. The way I put it is simply this. If I walk into a courtroom today and I see a defendant on trial for rape and murder of a woman, and they trot out the DNA evidence before the jury, it convinces a jury of 12 beyond a reasonable doubt. 1 chance in 5 billion is DNA evidence probability. 1 chance in 5 billion that this indeed is the culprit, that he belongs in jail, and he is guilty of the crime that's been committed because the DNA matches. But now we're talking about numbers far in excess of that, and yet the skeptic will say that it came about by chance, or we'll hear some of the common objections here after the break. Well, this has been a great discussion here to set up the teleological argument. We've talked about the main constant, which is the cosmological constant, tuned to 1 chance in 10 to the 120th power. That's a 1 with 120 zeros after it. Good luck figuring that out, or accounting for it, which is what I asked the skeptic. How can you account for this number? So let's go ahead and continue our discussion after this break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more.
Well, I'm here with Mr. Allen Hainline, and today we're discussing the teleological argument for the existence of God. But before we get back into that, we have a segment on our show, Alan, that we like to spring on our guests, and that is a time of rapid questions, just some funny, silly questions that we like to ask our guests so we can get to know them personally. This is about 60 seconds. You won't be able to hear the time clock, but our audience will. So are you ready?
Sure.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and get started. Go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Amazon.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Taco Bell.
What school did you go to?
UT Austin.
What song is playing on the radio today?
I don't think I've heard any today.
All right. Well, where would you like to live?
Say Florida.
Favorite sport?
Basketball.
What kind of razor do you use?
I use one of those that you turn it on, it vibrates, but it's a handheld.
What fruit would you say your head is shaped like?
I don't know, maybe like an apple or something.
Most hated sports franchise. Most hated sports franchise.
The Patriots. New England Patriots.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No.
Would you drink one if it was given to you?
Probably so.
Oh,
sure.
There you go. Sounds good. Thank you for playing rapid questions. Excellent. Well, let's get back to the teleological argument here. And of course, if we bring up and trot out this evidence to a skeptic, an atheist, particularly a militant atheist, there will inevitably come common objections to this argument. We have demonstrated a probability that is astronomical, and if we stack upon them more probabilities with other constant, you talked about electron, proton, their ratios, their masses, and those have giant probabilities as well. They begin to have these common objections. So they'll say something like this: "You're just quoting quack scientists who have manipulated the math to suit your case."
Well, I don't know where they've been studying about it, but yeah, if you look, you can read. I mean, while Luke Barnes, for example, wrote a review paper, peer-reviewed, in which he read, I think, 200 articles and quoted, or he listed as references at least 100 of them, and they're by people like Martin Rees. He was the Astronomer Royal of the UK for a number of years. Nobel Prize winners like Frank Wilczek and many top physicists will very much affirm the fine-tuning that life-permitting physics is rare among possibilities.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, if they're not a believer in God, they're going to tend to opt for, any explanation other than God as that for that.
Yeah, and we'll get to those. So, of course, Leonard Susskind, Leonard Susskind, father of string theory, Roger Penrose, all these people affirm fine tuning.
Yeah, it's hard to find people that really question it, and some might say, well, maybe it's a little overrated or something, or give us more time. But those who study it in detail, virtually all of them will acknowledge that there's at least a certain amount of fine tuning going on, and that this calls out for a deeper explanation of some sort.
All right, and then another quick objection. It's just a brute fact that the universe is finely tuned. It is just the way it is. There's no need for a God. What do you say, Al?
Well, you could say that about anything, but see, I think that's really a fair statement on naturalism. On naturalism, they're stuck with saying it's a brute fact. You got all these possibilities. It just happened to be this certain way. We got incredibly lucky. But as theists, or as people that even think that it's possible God exists, you can consider an alternative hypothesis for which it's not as improbable that the universe would be life permitting. On theism, you could posit that God would set this up for life. Most atheists like to trot out the problem of evil, which I think is a challenging one, a difficult one. But what's motivating them is they think God should favor life. Well, that's the only really assumption you need in the fine-tuning argument, is that, in fact, you don't even have to think it's probable that God would want life. If you just think it's not that ridiculously unlikely that God would want a universe that permits life, then that's all you need for this to be viewed as evidence for theism over atheism by kind of Bayesian probability theory.
Yeah, so, if someone, I like canned responses. As trained apologists, we like to use canned responses when we're starting to engage with atheists. So it's a brute fact. It just is the way it is. And I just respond, let me see if this convinces you. God exists. It's just the way it is. Does that convince you? Of course it doesn't. And you and I both know, Alan, the laws of physics could have been different. Say gravity could have been stronger, and I would have to be on a perpetual diet all the time. That's just the way it would work if it wasn't exactly what it is today. So another common objection, it's just a happy accident. If there's a chance, just a chance, it's going to happen. Let me go ahead and play a video real quick on this.
What do you think the chances are of
Dumb and Dumber.
Guy like you?
I wondered if it was going to be that one. Yeah.
Ending up together.
Well, Lloyd, that's difficult to say.
My chances.
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
There's a chance, and that's what a skeptic might say, If there's a chance, there's a chance.
And he was latching on to a 1 in 1,000,000, whereas we're talking about much less likely chances.
Yes. So, for example, if I was playing a poker game, and I get 4 aces, 4 hands in a row, I could just turn to the skeptic and say, there was a chance. I'm taking your money each time. I'm raking it right in. There was a chance. Yeah. I'm sure there would be quite a bit of incredulity at that point. All right, let's go ahead and go on to another objection. This one's very common. I was recently at a atheistic conference up in Milwaukee, the Mythicist Conference up there. And, of course, I had the T-shirt that I have on right now. It's Keep Calm and Have Faith.
Oh,
and I was getting engaged by these atheists constantly, and I would, of course, bring up this teleological argument to them. And in the 3 discussions that I had with 2 individuals each time, so 6 individuals total, they brought out this very common objection, and it's Douglas Adams' puddle. Could you tell us what Douglas Adams' puddle argument or counter-argument objection is?
Sure, yeah, I've encountered it quite often as well, and that motivated me to do a video on my YouTube channel on that, just that one objection, because I noticed that a lot of the prominent or the most popular anti-fine tuning videos out there would reference this, almost all of them, just as you say. So this basically, I mean, first of all, let's say that Douglas Adams he's a good author, and even his point about this puddle analogy may be a valid one in some context.
Yeah, so what is this puddle analogy? What is this objection?
Yeah, what he says, in fact, I've got the quote right here. He says, "This is rather as if you imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in, an interesting hole I find myself in. Fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. Must have been made to have me in it." And so there may be a lesson there, but it is totally different than the case of fine tuning. If we had actually discovered in doing fundamental physics that virtually any set of parameter values and initial conditions would have produced life, then it would be like any hole being able to hold water. But it's just the opposite. We found that very few, almost none of them among possibilities would support life. And so it's very disanalogous. In fact, there was an interesting interview a while back by a guy named David Deutsch. I think he's an atheist. He's not at all, believer in God, but he said that analogy specifically as applied to fine tuning doesn't hold water. So I think, it's just there's no way to make that kind of a connection in that analogy and the fine tuning. And I don't, as far as I know, I'm not sure Douglas Adams himself did, but Richard Dawkins, a whole bunch of other people have tried to apply that to fine tuning.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, really. They're making a category error, and they're basically saying that a little crevice out in the parking lot with a drop in it, and the largest lake on planet Earth, if that puddle were to become conscious, look around and say, yeah, this was made for me. What a surprise. How amazing is that? Is sort of the mocking tone that the atheist will have. But as you said, it's not. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I thought you were finishing that thought. But I was just going to say that, the fine tuning itself was discovered originally not by theists who were looking for it, but by non-theist physicists who were just looking at these various coincidences. And the more they studied them, the more they realized how you need to have a large number of these coincidences for there to be life.
Yes, any configuration of dirt can produce a hole that you can fill with water. But the fine-tuning is stating the exact opposite. Therefore, it's a category error. And I actually, what I do is I attack them presuppositionally. I'm saying to them that the fine-tuning, particularly with the cosmological constant, that the hole wouldn't even exist were it not for the fine-tuning. And usually that got around it.
It's also not anthropocentric in the sense that it's not just people saying, the universe is so special just for humans. That's a separate thing to evaluate. But really the fine-tuning is saying that without fine-tuning, you wouldn't even have complex structures. So you wouldn't be able to have really life of any kind.
Yeah. So leading into that, actually, there's another objection that states, we are adapted to the universe, not the universe being adapted to us. It's a very common objection.
Yeah, that totally misses the point of the fine-tuning as well, because they're looking at what is necessary before evolution can start is one way to kind of characterize it, before you can get the first life form. So if you think of a universe that lasts, a few seconds, never cools below 1 million degrees, is it plausible to think that life could adapt? Well, it's got to get started before it can adapt. And before life can get started, you've got to have some way to replicate information and store it. And those things wouldn't even be possible without some level of fine-tuning.
Yeah, excellent. One, the more common objection, you referenced a book by Luke Barnes, and he takes the theist position. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's really, I think, the best book out there on fine-tuning.
What's the title of it?
It's called A Fortunate Universe, and it's written by Luke Barnes and Geraint Lewis. They're two PhD-educated physicists. They got PhDs from Cambridge University, and Cambridge University Press published the book. They both reside now in Australia, and they're both really really good physicists. And it's the interesting thing is that, yeah, Barnes does make the case for theism as the best explanation of the fine-tuning in the book. Most of the book is actually just about the fine-tuning, about all these ways the universe could go wrong. And both authors agree, well, with the exception of one footnote, they agree on every possible thing and how this is something significant. It requires a deeper explanation. And then the last chapter, Barnes says, well, I think God is the best explanation. And Lewis says, well, I think I'm going to hold out for this multiverse. Maybe if we had enough other universes with varying laws, we could get lucky eventually. And that's what his explanation would be for it.
All right, so let's
it's a great
talk.
book, I think, to recommend it to skeptics, because you get both kind of viewpoints represented, and you get a lot of good information about physics in a very understandable and entertaining way.
So Lewis opts for this very common assertion, and we can say that skeptical cosmologists, those that are studying the fine-tuning of the universe and the development of the universe, will opt for this multiverse objection. So you've explained it a little bit. Can you elaborate more on what the multiverse is?
Sure, yeah, it is sort of a suite of different theories. You know, normally in the past, when you heard the word universe, you would just think, well, that's everything physical. Well, now there's this thought that, well, maybe the universe started by our Big Bang is somehow causally disconnected from other regions of space-time, where there might be other similar universes that maybe started from their own version of a Big Bang. That would be one version of a multiverse theory. And so if that's true, and if you get different laws and constants in these different universes, and obviously you'd get different initial conditions. If you had enough of them, and note that you'd need a vast number, then maybe it could serve as an explanation of fine-tuning.
Yeah, so in other words, we have our universe, uni meaning one and one universe, and we can see to the conceivably see to the very boundary of this universe. We really don't know what's beyond it. And so out there, beyond the observable universe, there may be other universes birthing each other and birthing, and they have a number of now to 10 to the 500th, because the probability that we spoke of in the beginning, first half of the show, was the cosmological constant being 1 chance in 10 to the 120th power. That's a 1 with 120 zeros after it. But we need more probabilities, more chances. So we need to have this theory called the multiverse that gives us 1 chance in 10 to the 500th opportunities to luck out on this fine-tuning.
Yeah, that 10 to the 500th, by the way, that came about in string theory.
Correct.
And it's not as though every string theorist would go with that. I mean, they haven't even written down the equations for string theory, so there's at least put a little bit of an asterisk by that, but that might be a reasonable guess at the number of different possible constants you could have if string theory is true. But string theory by itself doesn't even give you the multiplicity of universes. For that, they need to appeal to something independent, such as eternal inflation is kind of a leading theory. But one of the challenges with the multiverse is you have all these independent things that have to be true for which we have no evidence whatsoever before it can even be a candidate explanation of the fine-tuning.
Yep.
And each one of them seems to have certain obstacles. So there's certain significant challenges to the multiverse as an explanation of fine-tuning. Now, you know, God could have made a multiverse. I have no particular opinion about whether there is a multiverse or not. I think it's very difficult to have any evidence for or against. That's part of the problem with it. But there's actually one thing worth mentioning is that there's some recent research done by Luke Barnes and a team at Durham University and some others in which they did simulations of the evolution of the universe with different values of the cosmological constant, and saw that, and I mentioned this earlier, but again, the actual value of the cosmological constant could be 50 or 60 times greater and not mess things up for life. And the interesting thing about this is that previously Steven Weinberg had made a prediction that a lot of multiverse advocates really jumped on and said, look, somebody's predicted the value of the cosmological constant based on a multiverse scenario, because he got fairly close to estimating the value of the cosmological constant with the theory that, well, if we just got lucky it would have to still be this really small value just for us to exist. But it turns out that prediction even has been, to some degree anyway, falsified by later research. It really is not. It's not a very good prediction, because it turns out that the universe could have been, the cosmological constant could have been much bigger and still produce a life-permitting universe.
All right.
So that's an example of one of the ways in which people try to evaluate whether the multiverse exists or not, is look at predictions of underlying physics, and then look at our universe. That's the only sample we have. And then look at how close is it to what values we would expect among life-permitting universes. Ours should be typical among life-permitting universes if these multiverse theories are true. And in many ways, they're not. That one is not a real clear-cut one, but it's some at least slight problem for the multiverse. A bigger one, I think, is, and this was pointed out by Oxford physicist Roger Penrose, who documented an even more finely tuned criteria than the cosmological constant. He said that the initial conditions of our universe had to be incredibly finely tuned to produce an ordered universe that would permit life. And he put the fine tuning to 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. So the exponent on that number is bigger than the fine tuning of cosmological constant.
Oh, yeah.
You couldn't even write out the number. It's so big. So anyway, he says that the multiverse is worse than useless for explaining that fine tuning, because it's predicted on these multiverse theories that it'd be more probable to produce smaller universes, which are exponentially easier to fine tune, than it is that we should have such a huge, large universe, which requires an incredible amount of fine tuning. It becomes much more difficult to fine tune it the larger it is. Even Sean Carroll admits the multiverse is not a good explanation for that fine tuning. And so those kinds of things are part of the challenge, that there really hasn't been a multiverse theory yet that's been able to overcome those challenges. But, if you're an atheist or a naturalist, I can see why there would be a tendency to kind of just, keep assuming there might be one. If you're so convinced God doesn't exist, you're assuming there's got to be something out there that's going to make this look like a more natural explanation.
Yeah, we just need more chances. That's simply what it comes down to, because this fine-tuning is so exquisite. And as you stated, Roger Penrose's 1 chance in 10, raised to the 10, raised to the 123rd power. You can start scribbling that on a sheet of paper, and I can assure you, you'll die before you get a chance to write it all out. The way the chances work is simply like this. The way the multiverse, another analogy, if you're trying to explain this to someone, we'll take a deck of cards. We used a poker analogy earlier. 52 cards, and if I were to rearrange them in multiple combinations, that would be, in math terms, 52 factorial. That is to say, 52 times 51 times 50, all the way down to the end. And that would give me this number of combinations. But as you spoke about with these universes burping each other or birthing each other, what it does is it produces more decks. So you have now not just 52 cards, but 104 cards, and then you keep going another, and then you can rearrange that. 104 factorial, that is 104 times 103 times 102. But there's more decks being produced, and so you get more chances, and that is this sort of internal inflation. So the skeptics have gone all the way from just the universe to infinite universes out there as a possibility, just to explain this fine-tuning.
It is interesting that in the past, skeptics would give theists a hard time for, you guys are positing, this unseen entity out there. And then now they're turning to these other universes, which by definition, if it interacts with our universe, it's generally considered part of our universe. So it's not just that we haven't detected these other universes yet. It's that in principle, it would be impossible for them to be causally connected, at least by the general definition of a multiverse. So that's really even worse than theism in terms of, in theism, we say that God is interacting, we can evaluate evidence, whereas here, you really have to just look at theoretical physics. And I'd be the first to grant that even though maybe it's arguable whether it's science or science of the same type, that we shouldn't dismiss the multiverse as a possibility just because it's harder to confirm. It's going to be more indirect. Any confirmation we do get they're trying to do it by just looking at the predictions of theoretical physics, if that predicts multiverses, and then if we can confirm other predictions that it also predicts, then maybe we could have some level of confidence that the multiverse exists. But so far, I don't see that as really being there at this point, especially when you look at also the fact that in order for a multiverse scenario to produce these vast numbers of universes with varying laws, you end up needing to fine-tune the multiverse generator. That's been a real problem for getting away from fine-tuning, is you really, not just any universe generating mechanism could be so fecund, if you will, could be so productive as to produce that many other universes with varying laws. So there's a lot of challenges to the multiverse as an explanation of fine-tuning.
So to simply put, the way I say this to a skeptic when they bring the multiverse up, I say to them, listen, you're actually stepping into my world now. You're looking for an explanation outside the universe, the naturalistic explanation outside the universe, to explain the existence of this universe. It's just far more reason. Welcome to my world. And I'm telling you that it is God that created it. So let us go ahead and wrap this up. The final thing I said to people, the main question for the fine-tuning is, I'm asking the skeptic, how do I account for this improbability? And the skeptic will say, sometimes I've had them say, well, I don't know. And the response from me is, well, you're engaging in what's called atheism of the gaps. And that is to say that this is so improbable, I have no idea how it came about, but one thing I do know for sure, God couldn't have done it.
I've definitely heard that as well. Yeah, it does seem to be a bit of a naturalism of the gaps.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Allen. Do you have plug your YouTube channel? Any other forthcoming projects you have coming in the near future, please?
Yeah, thanks. I do have a YouTube channel which is called Finely Tuned Universe. And so, yeah, you can find that at YouTube, and I hope that you would want to subscribe, check out some of the videos there. I'm planning to put some more out there actually on the multiverse in the near future. Also, I do have a series of blogs you can find at crossexamine.org. If you just Google Allen Hainline fine-tuning blog, you'll find those easily enough. And then Luke Barnes and I kind of feel honored, humbled to be able to co-author a chapter of a Harvest House book that's upcoming with Luke Barnes, and there's other prominent authors of the book of their own chapters like William Lane Craig and so forth. So it's my first foray into being an author, and it's a great opportunity. We're just trying to bring these down to a real lay level, and that's probably the only reason I'm included in there, to be honest. But to just try to make it understandable, some of these interesting things from science that I think do point to God.
Well, thank you, Allen. It was a pleasure definitely speaking with you and learning more about your wisdom and your contribution to the cosmological argument as an argument for the existence of God.
Thanks a lot, David. Glad to hear that you're using the argument a lot and finding it interesting. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Take care now. Have a nice weekend.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Well, to the audience out there, I want to play one last video. This is from Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, and he makes a shocking confession. That's what the title of it is called on YouTube. And let's go ahead and play that to show you one of the preeminent atheists in the entire world at the time and his thoughts on the cosmological, the teleological argument, the argument for fine-tuning.
At some point, certainly, we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine-tuning the 1 degree, one hair different, nothing. But even though it doesn't prove a designer could all have happened without it, you have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not a trivial.
So there you have it. One of the preeminent atheists in the entire world at the time admitting that the best argument from the theistic side is the fine-tuning argument. Before we leave, I want to mention that our Defenders Conference is coming up on September 28th and 29th. Tickets are still available, and you can find those on the website, thedefendersconference.com. That's thedefendersconference.com. Next week, Kurt Jarvis will be back in the saddle, and we'll be speaking about this very title here, Survival Guide for the Soul on Soul Renewal with Ken Sigmatsu. And we'll have the pleasure of listening to that interview next week. Well, that does it for the show today. I am grateful for our continued support of our patrons and partnerships with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky 4, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. Thank you for Rob for filling in here for Chris this week. Thanks to our guest, Allen Hainline. Thank you for listening in and striving for truth, faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.